Hi everyone. Right, I think we're ready to start now. So thanks everyone for joining us. This morning is a very special product talk. We have Lou Downe with us this morning. Lou is the former design director of the UK government and is also responsible for introducing service design into the UK government, which is also the topic of Lou's talk this morning. So without further ado, Lou, over to you.
Hi everyone. It's super nice to be back with the BPDTS DWP family. So hi to everyone who I know from my GDS days, and hi to everyone I don't. It's really lovely to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit, hello, about a book that I just wrote. Seems strange to say that, but yeah, it's a book that I just wrote about good services and how to design services that work. So I guess the reason why I wrote this book was actually just because most services are terrible, and this is not just defined to public services. Private services are also equally guilty of just not fulfilling the needs that we need of them, and also kind of causing this huge burden on our lives of extra time and extra effort that we spend interacting with them. And you know, for someone who's been in the service design industry for a very long time now, it's frustrating that they don't seem to be getting any better. You know, we talk a lot about creating sort of magical and wonderful experiences for people, or particularly in the public sector, making things easier for people to do, and yet it's something that a service needs to do in order to ever get done. And so I started kind of thinking about this, and I wanted to tell you a story a little bit at the beginning, just to kind of highlight what I mean by most services are terrible, and the kind of space that we have to improve. So this is Anne. Anne is a school teacher just outside of Rochdale in New York, and she has 3 jobs. She doesn't make a huge amount of money, and she qualified as a teacher in 2001. She earns approximately about kind of $55,000, which in UK money is about £42,000 for a single mum of 3 kids living just outside of New York. Not a lot of money to be living on. And she also owes the US government about $77,000 in student loans, which again, not particularly unusual amount of money to be owing the government, because US education is expensive. And she can't afford to make her monthly repayments. Pretty common story for a lot of people in her position. But the good news is that the US government, not this current US government, but the previous one, created a scheme that would mean that as a public servant, she would be eligible to not repay her loan after a certain period of time, which is really great. But the conditions of that mean that she would have to pay 120 consecutive payments over 10 years. And Anne has not done that. So Anne will now be paying back her loan for 25 years or more. And it's because of a company called Navient. So this is them. And aside from I think for any of the content designers in the room here, a pretty appalling content design on their front page. I have no idea what that paragraph actually means. Navient also practice so Navient, sorry, just to say, Navient are one of 7 companies who distribute US student loans. Because in the US, they don't have a student loans organization, they have private companies doing it. So Navient practice what they call a 7-minute rule, which means that if you work for Navient in their call center, you have to answer the call and resolve it in under 7 minutes, or you don't make your bonus. And you can imagine the people who work for Navient earn even less than Anne does, and so are very unincentivized to go over the 7-minute rule. Which means that when Anne tried to lower her payments, she was told to pause them rather than lowering them, meaning that she wasn't eligible for that scheme anymore. And this is basically because the only thing you can do for a customer who can't pay in 7 minutes is to pause their payments with Navient. Which means that Anne, rather than making 120 consecutive payments over 10 years, has made 83 payments over 19 years, paying far more than she would have had to pay had they not had that rule in place. And I think this speaks to the fact that I think we probably all know this, particularly in the context that we're working in government, particularly your area, is that bad services ruin lives. They don't just make things more inconvenient or more time consuming for us. They really do have a fundamental effect on the fact that, you know, someone like Anne now has to work 3 jobs and will not pay her student loan back. So these are really, really big changes that really subtle things to our services have on people. And it's not just individual users we're harming in this space. In 2018, there was actually a record shortage of teachers in the US, partially because people just can't afford to train to be a teacher because they're not going to earn the amount of money they need to pay off their student loan afterwards. And this has a massive effect actually on the education of our kids as well. So in California alone, 80% of schools are now appointing unqualified teachers because they can't find enough qualified teachers. So it's having an effect on the quality of the education of our children. When you kind of take that over to a UK kind of context and the sort of cost of bad services to us, roughly about 80% of the cost of the UK government is spent on services. Some of you may have seen this slide before. It's funny and how little we talk about this kind of in government, I think, generally the cost of bad services. But anyway, so about 80% of our cost is spent on services. Not unsurprising, we are a service provider. What is more surprising is that if you take most government departments, at least the top 7 across central government, about 60% of the cost of our services is spent on calls and casework. So basically people phoning us or coming into one of our centres or sending us a letter or sending us an email or something along those lines, basically because they couldn't use a service, digital service from end to end. And if you look at just the amount of calls that we get, on average, about 53% of the calls to central government are to do with checking how to do something. Basically, how do I become a childminder? How do I learn to drive or start business or, you know, kind of look after my family when I've lost my job? Really, really simple things they should be able to do on their own. And when you look at the cost of that to UK taxpayer, about a third of UK GDP is spent on public services. So that amount of money is not a small amount of money to each of us as citizens, let alone each of us as public servants, which sort of means that bad service design is one of the biggest unnecessary costs to the UK taxpayer, and yet we don't talk about it. You know, it's never going to hit the Daily Mail. It's not going to be something that, you know, our ministers are ever kind of, you know, bashing us over the head about. And I think, you know, kind of, I've been thinking about this question for a long time, as you can imagine. The amount of times I've been in ministers' offices talking about just that stat and watching the exact same expression go over their face as they realise that actually this is a much, much bigger problem than they thought it was. And I think the reason why we don't talk about it very much is that services are invisible. And they're kind of invisible by their nature because they're the spaces between things. They're the space between you booking something and it arriving, you know, kind of getting diagnosed with a condition and being treated, realizing you've lost your job and getting benefits. They're the things between different things in our lives. And so we often don't see them as users, and we certainly often don't see them as service providers either. And they sort of look a bit like this, I think. You know, this guy sort of invisibly sort of standing on the corner. This is a photograph that I ended up putting in the book, who is performing the act of being the post office sign while the other sign is being repaired. And they sort of sink into the background. You don't notice them until they go wrong. And so actually, in reality, service design is much more likely to be the product of technology compromises, of legal boundaries, of political trends or personal taste, than it is actually the product of conscious design. Because in order to be able to design something, you need to be able to actually recognize that it exists in the first place. And that isn't something we're very good at. So you end up with services like this. So this is actually a Ministry of Justice service, interestingly enough. But it could, to be honest, probably be a service from any bit of government. And that's why we end up with services like this, because they are the combination of all of those different unthinking decisions that end up having an effect on our users. And so when it comes to making an organization user-centered, it's really, really difficult to get over this, like really, really, really hard. And I want to just sort of talk about something that probably you're all aware of, but the fact that actually the hardest part of getting your organization to realize it is realize that it needs to be user-centered is to realize it's a service provider in the first place, to actually see its services as things that can be designed, things that can be consciously designed, rather. And I think this comes down to a sort of concept of service literacy, where actually we need to start being able to see services and understand what they are. And that really comes down to, a product of seeing services as something that can be designed and realizing actually, that all of those decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis have an effect on a thing that we call a service. I think it also has to do with understanding what makes a good service. So actually kind of picturing what we mean by good and what we mean by bad. And sometimes we don't all share the same opinion on that. And then committing to actually designing them. So it's all very well seeing a service and understanding what makes a good service, but actually putting the money and the effort and the policy behind actually redesigning that service to make it better for users. You need all of those three things to actually have a sense of service literacy in your organization. So I'm not going to talk about those other things today because we would be here all day, but I am going to talk about this middle one, which is what I wrote the book about. And I think this is the bit that people often sort of struggle with the most, actually. And I think partially they struggle with it because often when we talk about what makes a good service, you'll get the answer, it depends. And, a dog grooming service is different to one that, kind of helps you back into work. Of course it is. But there are some things that actually everyone needs from almost every service they use. And they are really basic things like being able to find it. And you hit Google and find that service without having to resort to, kind of somewhere else to help you find that service? Can you use it without already having to be an expert in how it works? Is there an endless instruction manual on how to apply for this thing or how to get access to it? And being able to complete it from start to finish without any dead ends. So if you lose your phone, can you actually still access the service if you have two-factor authentication turned on? These are all questions which are really, really important. And so about 2 years ago, in fact, actually, I think I was running a workshop with a lot of civil servants in it, talking about what we mean by a good service. And it sort of spiraled into creating a list that then got published as a Google Doc and had over 2,000 comments on it of what we mean collectively, people not just in public service, but also everywhere else and across the world, by what do we mean by a good service. And these 15 principles are not the only things. You will find other unique, bespoke things about your service that mean that it does what users need it to do. But these are the 15 sort of most basic things that pretty much every service needs to do in order to be able to actually achieve what it needs to do for a user. So I'm not going to talk about all of them again, because it would take a long time, but I am going to talk about two that are particularly important. So I'm going to start with a good service is easy to find. This is one that we really, really struggle with in my experience in public sector. And it's for lots of different reasons. But so this is, just to give you an example, this is the fishing rod license service. And this man has absolutely fantastic eyebrows and also his own branded shirt, which I was very envious of taking this picture. So the fishing rod license service is kind of interesting, and it's a service that's provided by DEFRA, and it's there to essentially kind of originally it was created by Henry VIII to protect fish stocks from poachers on royal land. So not exactly like the most socially beneficial reason for creating a public service. But it now provides really valuable money to look after our inland rivers and waterways. And it's one of the oldest services in UK government. It's 267 years older than the United States as the United States. And you can actually, if you really, really want to, when we're allowed into spaces like this, you can go and see it on vellum in the National Archives, which I think makes it probably one of the oldest pieces of service design that I've ever seen. It's very exciting for service design geeks of you. But it's one of about 10,000 services that we have. We don't know how many services, I think, still there are in UK government, because we've never counted them. But at the last count, there were about 10,000. And a large portion of them kind of look a little bit like this. And apologies, I think some of these may be DWP services, but I hope you'll all agree. If you weren't familiar with these things originally, you wouldn't know what they were. And I've sort of shown this slide to many people, including groups of civil servants from departments that own these services, and sometimes people even in those departments don't know what those services are, because they're a collection of nouns. They're a collection of names of things that you need to know in order to know what you're looking for. And so if you were trying to start a business or learn to drive, I have no idea which one you would use. And my favorite is still the sheep and cattle tracing service from DEFRA, which is called ARAMS, which is possibly one of the finest acronyms that exist in the public service, but still not a great way of naming your services. And it has a really profound effect, actually, on the way that people interact with government and the way that people actually kind of complete services. And it means that, this is the top content on the performance platform. And you can see there at number 8, you've got contact DVLA. So basically, try and find a phone number, which sort of means that the 8th most popular service on gov.uk right now is a phone number, or at the point that this was taken. And that is not the bright, shiny digital future that I think we all have in mind, of helping people to just get on with their lives and do what they need to do by using a digital service. We didn't want to make it easier for people to find a phone number. Not that we wanted to make it harder, but we wanted to make it easier for people to actually do the thing rather than call us about how to do the thing. And it's not really our fault. Our services weren't designed for the internet. Most government services were designed for a world that looked like this. There was actually a flurry of services that were created around the kind of 30s, 40s, 50s. So a time when essentially you walked into either a government office on the high street or a post office or some form of public sector organisation, and you said, how do I do a thing? How do I learn to drive or start this business? Or, how do I get benefits or various other things? And that person behind the desk would say, exactly how you should do it. They'd probably have the form, they'd probably help you fill it out. They'd probably give you a pen and post it. And that is not how services work on the internet now. And services work on the internet now in a way that actually Google is the homepage to your service. And unless you can find a service, you can't use it. And what we have in government is a big pile of Google fails, things that you would not be able to find unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. And I think this comes down to a really kind of basic principle that actually good services are verbs and bad services are nouns. And so what I mean by that for the grammatically challenged, including myself, is basically good services are doing words. They're doing sentences like learn to drive, become a childminder, get a pension. They're not things like SORN or statutory off-road vehicle notification, charity letter forwarding service, or employer ownership pilot, all things that you wouldn't necessarily know what they were unless you were looking for them. And so changing your services to work in this way can be really, really super simple. And I say they can be super simple. The negotiation that goes on with policy behind the scenes to get to this point is not simple. So I would never underestimate that. But something like DVLA, just changing the name of the service. They've still got the acronym there for people who know what it is. But to register your vehicle as off the road means that it is so much more easily usable. And means that you can actually start rationally collecting those things into services that make sense for people as step-by-step guides. So learning how to drive a car, for example. I'll skip over this one sort of slightly, but essentially those things can easily be indexable by Google as voice services as well as being readable by humans. If you make things easily more usable for humans, then you also make it easier to read for machines as well, turns out. So when it comes to finding a service, there's some really basic principles. Nothing is more important than its name. It's not just about findability. It's also about understanding what that service is for and who it's for. That's really important about the name. The name should reflect something that a user is trying to do. Again, really obvious, but not necessarily easy for us to do. And should use words that a user will understand. So things like remittance, for example, in the Ministry of Justice, whilst that might make sense to court judges in terms of, not paying a bill, makes absolutely no sense to users, and also is used in a medical context as well, which they might be more familiar with. So be really careful about the words that you use and use words that your users will understand and recognise. So I want to talk a little bit about principle number 12 as well, which I think is a particularly kind of relevant one for people working in the public sector. And that's around encouraging the right behaviours from users and staff. So thinking back to that Navient example, where you've got people within Navient who are incentivized hugely to offer basically a bad service to users. We often have that situation unthinkingly in our kind of services as well. And the person who created that 7-minute rule, I'm sure, thought that the only thing they were doing was creating more efficiency in their service. I don't think that they thought for 1 minute that they would have a massive effect on how children get educated and whether or not they have access to qualified teachers. I'm sure that never even crossed their mind. But that's kind of the problem, is that when we create incentivization for people within our services, either our staff or our users, we often don't really think about the negative impacts of that on their lives in general. So when you think about kind of service quality KPIs, this is probably what you end up with, a lot of jargon. There are various different frameworks. You can go and find them on the internet. They exist. The problem with a lot of them is that they kind of either measure the wrong thing, or they are so complicated they don't really have an impact. And unless people pay attention to a KPI, then there's almost no point in having it. And I want to talk about an example that actually happened in the mid-90s when Tony Blair was, if we can all cast our minds back to that time, Tony Blair was going for his second re-election. Kind of wide shoulders were still in vogue, as were, the fashions of the kids in the background. I'm sure we all kind of recognise some of those, me personally. And one of Tony Blair's major campaign points for his re-election was around the NHS and around the ability that people had to access particularly primary care, particularly GPs, within a short period of time. There was a lot of really bad press around this time around people basically not being able to get access to a doctor's appointment for weeks and weeks. And it was having a really negative effect on his campaign. So he basically came out and said, look, I'm going to sort this. I will sort it by basically cutting the waiting time to see a doctor to 48 hours. Makes perfect sense. Everyone thought it was great. Only it didn't work out quite like that. And Tony Blair ended up on question time. At the point where people were starting to realise that this wasn't quite working out. And I think he thought it was going to be a really great opportunity for him to talk about the success of all of these policies he'd put in place. And in fact, what he ended up with was a very awkward question from a lady called Diana Church in the audience, who said, I can't make an appointment with my doctor within a week's time because you're not only allowed to make it 48 hours beforehand. And when I try to call on the day, I can't get through. And I think probably many of us actually remember this experience, that rather than, this amazing kind of statement of cut the waiting time to see a doctor to 48 hours, what actually happened within doctor surgeries who felt incredibly pressured to meet this target was that they decided that in order to meet that target, they would make it impossible for someone to book an appointment more than 48 hours ahead of time, leaving those slots for people who phoned up within 48 hours to make an appointment, which of course forced everyone into this incredibly urgent situation of waiting 48 hours before the time they wanted the appointment, then phoning and not being able to get through because everyone else was doing the same. And Tony Blair's response to the question was, well, obviously it shouldn't work like that. And actually the presenter at the time asked, because his rebuttal to it on Question Time was basically, well, this must be an isolated incident. And the presenter asked the audience who had experienced the same thing as Diana Church, and almost the entire audience put their hands up. So let that be a lesson to you, that really tiny KPIs can have a massive effect on your political career if you ever wanted to get into that situation. But I think the real message behind this is that actually what gets measured gets done. If you put in place a target for 48 hours, people will try and meet that, regardless of what effect that has on users. And so if we really want to actually reach a particular outcome for users or for our staff, we need to measure the outcome we want to achieve, not the task that we want to get done. Because it turns out probably people in doctor surgeries would have worked out a better way of making sure that people had access to appointments within 48 hours if they hadn't have been given a target, if they were actually had been given an outcome that they were supposed to be achieving rather than a target or a task. So when it comes to KPIs and incentivization and making sure that everyone is working towards making sure that a user has a better service, you've kind of got three things to think about. It's not just about KPIs and incentives. Those are really important, things like 48 hours or, various other kind of things that you're setting. But you've also got the business model, You've also got the business model, which is super important. So we have an interesting situation actually at Homes England at the moment where our business model is, and the cost of providing our services is so expensive that we only usually work with much larger builders and organisations than we probably should do, therefore skewing the market so that it's much harder to be an SME builder in this country than it should be. So our business model is having a negative effect on the incentivization and the effect of our users. So it's also interactions and heuristics. We're all probably familiar with dark patterns, but it's not just dark patterns for our users, it's also dark patterns for our staff as well, equally kind of vulnerable to those things. So when you're thinking about incentivizing your staff and your users to work in the right way, always remember what you're trying to achieve. That can be really, really hard when people are trying to force you down a hole of kind of putting in place physical targets for tasks, not outcomes. But try to remember that. Make sure that you focus on balancing the behaviours you expect of your users and the benefits that you expect of your staff as well. Don't just focus on one of these. So if you think that actually some things where you incentivize your staff to do things like the Navient example, probably quite great for your staff to have an incentivization to get their bonus, but it actually has a negative effect on your users. So really important to balance those two things. And also make sure that the outcome you want to achieve is actually encoded in every layer of your organization. Don't just think about the KPIs, just think about the business model, the staff targets, and everything that you do that incentivizes both your users and your staff to achieve a particular outcome. So I'm going to stop talking now. This is the book. It's very jazzy. You can buy it on Amazon and also other places. Last week, I also launched the Good Services School of Good Services, so you can come and hang out and do some more training. There's a one-day masterclass for people who are new to service design or doing it as part of another role. And there is a two-day masterclass for people who are trying to kind of widen the impact of user-centered design in their organizations. You can access them here and have a look and see what's what. You can also, if you are very keen and very excited for when we get back to offices, you can buy some jazzy posters and stickers and stuff like that, and you can buy them from Good Services /shop. So thanks very much. If you want to chat more, this is where to find me.
Thanks, Lou. I don't know, Lou, are you okay to stick around and see whether or not we have any questions from the group? If people just want to either jump in or use the messaging, we'll see whether or not there's anything come through. So Izzy Johnson, will these slides be available? Lou, I'll speak to you to get access to the slides. What we've been doing with these product talks is actually publishing them onto our Confluence site. We've been doing a recording of all of the talks as well, and we are pushing those up into YouTube as well. So we'll combine both the video and the slides and make that accessible to everyone. Okay, thanks, Claire. Does anyone have any questions? I think there's one, or maybe just dropped in there from Caitlin. How did you find the process of getting a book published?
Ooh, good question. Oh man, that's a pub chat. It was interesting actually. I think the thing I would take from it is that getting a book published is not as hard as you think. And there are publishers out there that want to publish interesting and different things. And so if you have an idea that you think there is a market for, just go and speak to a publisher. The publisher for this one was a little Danish publisher called Biz. And they published This is Service Design Thinking. And we're looking around for another service design book and just put together a little pitch and send it to, kind of a few. I probably sent this to about 20 different publishers. I had some interesting conversations with O'Reilly. Don't approach O'Reilly about doing a service design book. Their main questions was, what is service design and is it really a thing? I was like, meh, yeah, probably it is. So yeah, maybe leave them off, but yeah, it's a lot easier than you think it would be.
I think Dan Howarth, I think you had a question. I think you put your hand up in the chat.
I did, yeah. Thanks, Phil. Hi, Lou. Thanks for a great talk. I'm a content designer on a health benefit, and I wondered if you could give us some advice, please, on how we can realistically make services better, considering, you know, the complexity of user situations and circumstances, surging demand from users, especially at the moment, legacy technology that we've got to kind of make our front end compatible with, and legacy business processes, and also teams who don't understand what we're trying to do and see us as a blocker to some kind of old school command and control culture.
Yeah, I know. I know that feeling. I don't think that ever really gets easier, and I don't think you ever really kind of get away from it, because there will always be people who are in the background who kind of doubt that there is a point to doing user research, or that, you know, content needs to be accessible, or all of the things that we really care about. And I think that the one thing that I've found that does work and does kind of get over the message to people like that is to actually stop talking about design, and to stop talking about users. And I know that feels really counterintuitive, but I think sometimes actually we end up kind of bashing people over the head with that message, and it either feels ideological, so we're either trying to push a particular approach that they don't believe in, or they actually do believe in doing things for users, and the fact that, you know, we're saying we need to make this more user-centered is kind of insulting to them because they feel like they're already doing that. And so sometimes I think that message just really doesn't land very well, and sometimes it does, and that's great, and you find some fantastic allies, and we should never stop talking about user needs, by the way. I'm not advocating that, but just sometimes a different approach is needed. And in that approach, actually, I would go back to the stats at the beginning of the slide. Those stats around, you know, the cost of bad services to government, all that kind of stuff. I actually created those so that we could create the service design community in government, and managed to find an economist at GDS who had some spare time going, and who worked with me to create those and do that study. And that was possibly the most powerful thing in helping people to understand why this was important, because they could actually understand what the cost of the bad service was. I think that's something that we actually forget sometimes, is actually just talking about the cost of bad services, going into that service and looking where people are dropping off, where it's causing extra costs somewhere else in someone else's budget, because people are phoning us because they can't use it. And it's not going to solve every instance like that, but there's a sort of, if you try the first attempt of, you know, kind of speaking about user needs and making things more user-centered, and that doesn't work, try the second approach of just talking about money and stop talking about design and users, and see if that works, because very often the people who don't resonate with the first message do really understand the second one.
Thanks, Lou. That's really good advice.
Okay, we've got a number of questions coming up in the chat. Chris, I've seen that you've got your hand up as well. I'll come to you soon. It's an interesting image there. So which public service sticks out in your mind, Lou, as an example of great service design, and why?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. I think my favourite is still Get Help with Court Fees from Ministry of Justice. And it's been talked about a lot, actually, as a really good example of service design. But I think that part of the reason is, yes, of course, it has a completely rational name, to get help with your court fees. It was originally the fee remittance service, and had an acronym, as you would expect. And the team essentially kind of took that existing service, worked with the people who were on the front line, basically on physical desks in courts, because they were more often the people who were providing that service rather than it being a digital native service. And they asked them, you know, like, how are people talking about this? How are you actually working your way around this service to provide a human service to those users? So they almost took the service that the physical, you know, kind of frontline staff were using anyway, and then just encoded that in a digital service that they then first of all tested with those people in those offices, and then made available online for people to use unaided. And so it was a really, really great example of just looking at what was already there and actually using the expertise of people who were already existing in that service and testing it in a really kind of small way and scaling it up. And now, you know, kind of is doing a super important thing of helping people who can't afford to pay for court fees to get access to it, where previously it was almost impossible for them to understand, because who understands the word remittance? You know, I don't.
Thanks. The next one is from Karen Lewis. How do you think the urgency of COVID has impacted service design, especially getting things out faster?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wrote a little bit of a blog post about this, so you can have a little look at that. I ended up sort of thinking this through, actually, because it is a really important question, and lots of people seem to be really struggling with the environment of you know, kind of more haste, less speed, or rather the opposite version of just get stuff out quickly. It doesn't matter whether or not it's good. And you could almost feel that pressure sort of starting to mount on designers and on people involved in design of services to just do compromises. And so I ended up there's a blog post of basically of principles for good service design in a crisis that are sort of an extension to the book, and I think probably kind of helpful. But I think the main thing that we need to remember is that we will look back on this time with the same kind of disdain as we look back on the early 90s for making compromises and decisions, and we will be unpicking those decisions for a long, long time unless we actually make the right decision. And it doesn't take a long time to make the right decision, it just takes a little bit of consideration. And, you know, going back to that example of Anne, you know, with the student loans, it only takes a small thing in our services to have a massive effect on our users. And we have more vulnerable users now than we ever had to have done before. And so we should be paying more attention to what they need and more attention to their vulnerabilities than we ever did before. So that means accelerated user research. It means accelerated prototyping. Sure, it means working faster, but it doesn't mean doing less of that user-centered thinking on our services. Absolutely not. So yeah, if you want to check that out, it's on my blog. So just look up Principles of Design in a Crisis and then my name and you'll find it.
Okay, great. We've got another one from Helen Gaskell. In your experience, what's the best way to get policy colleagues invested in UX design?
Good question. So this was like my lifelong mission when I was at GDS. Is the kind of the question of how do you get policy people involved in service design, and how do you bridge that gap? We actually did quite a lot of research on this and developed a training course, which I think is possibly still running, I'm not sure, around it. And I think the most important thing that we realized was that the main thing that is stopping that working relationship is actually a cultural difference and a cultural divide between people who are working in kind of digital and design and people who are working in policy. Just like any other cultural difference, you know, you've got people who speak different languages, they went to different schools, they listen to different music, they are different people who have different outlooks and different approaches to the world. And so, you know, when you approach a policy person about doing user research, they often look at you and go, you asked 10 people? We've got a population size of X billion. Are you sure that that's the right decision? Of course you're not. So I'm going to make the decision for you. And so a lot of what we ended up doing was actually, rather than focusing on just training policy people in how to do design or to understand design, is actually doing vice versa as well, and helping people in digital and design professions to really understand and empathize with their policy colleagues. And once you broke down those barriers and helped them to understand each other, they could work a lot better. So we ended up doing a kind of two-sided piece of training that was sort of design for policy people and then policy for designers. And then we put them in a room together in the second day and then said, okay, work on a problem now that you sort of understand each other a little bit more. And that was really positive. So I'm sure if you want to contact Martin Jordan at GDS, I think it's martin.jordan at digital.cabinet-office.gov.uk. He's probably got some details somewhere of what that course was, and if you want to run that here, I'm sure that would be really effective as well.
Okay, great. Thanks. Chris, I know you've been waiting a while. You had your hand up in the messages. Do you want to fire your question over?
Hi, yeah, thanks, Phil. Hi, Lou.
Hi.
I enjoyed that. Really good. I've got a countertop full of post-it notes here,
Excellent.
so that's a good sign. I'm currently involved in some work with some common services, internal kind of stuff that hopefully go towards making a better end product. I suppose my question is, do you have any thoughts on making these things visible internally? Because I think making something visible externally is kind of something that we all have our eye on. But very often you end up building something that somebody else has already built half of, because you don't know what's going on until it's kind of finished, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one that I'm quite familiar with. So you often, I found a lot of people ask that same question about how do you kind of make internal user services actually kind of as user-centered as services that we're providing outside. And there's often, kind of reading in your question, there's a bit of a sort of presumption that actually people internally maybe don't need the same level of kind of clarity on what the name of the service is, or ability to be able to find it, because ultimately they're already experts in it anyway. And I think there's a couple of things around that. So firstly, people aren't born experts in internal systems and services. They have to acquire that knowledge after years and years of training, which means that not only is it more expensive to onboard staff, but it also is more expensive to move them around, because it takes time to be able to upskill people, downskill people. They also spend more of their time just doing the overhead of finding stuff and using systems than they actually spend using their brain to help people to achieve a certain outcome. So the more time you spend as a call center staff, navigating the system, the less time you spend thinking about and caring about that person's problem. And so it reduces obviously the quality of your service as well. So I think those are messages that are really, really important to get across. The other side, I think, is actually just helping people to understand that those internal staff are users too. There was a poster doing around a few years ago that civil servants are users too. I think it's probably still on the gov.uk design Tumblr. You can probably get access to it, but it's such an important message that actually we need to start understanding what those user needs are, do exactly the same process that we would do elsewhere, understand who those people are, what they're trying to achieve, what problems they have, and actually focusing our investment and time on those things. But I think the main thing is actually just coming up with that really clear, compelling case for why it's really important to make internal services user focused, of which all of those things I just said earlier are kind of part of that. But if you can sort of almost pull together something that clearly describes what problems our bad internal systems and services are causing to our users generally, and why we need to focus on them as users, in my experience, that tends to help people to really kind of land the idea that actually, no, these are services, and these are services that enable us to provide a service to an end user, and that thing is really important.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got just a couple more questions. I hope you've still got time, Lou. The next one is from Lindsay Stevens. It says, you mentioned service literacy requires commitment from organisations to design them. How do you recommend getting stakeholder buy-in to do that?
Good question. So I think it's similar to the question earlier about how do you operate in an environment where people don't really care about design. And I think the answer to that being, don't ask them to care about design. Ask them to care about the things that they care about already, which is services are really expensive, they're really inefficient, and staff are not as productive as they should be. And reframe everything that you are doing in that language, in a language that they understand. Because if you think about the metaphor, if you want to have a conversation with someone and you want to get a message across, it's a lot easier to talk in their language than it is to get them to learn an entirely new language and then understand your message. So try and speak the language that they are speaking and talk about it in the way that they understand it. Even if it means sort of talking about things in ways that maybe you feel a bit uncomfortable with. I've been in that position where you're talking about, the kind of cost of a service rather than the fact that it's having a really negative impact on people's lives. But I think there's also the thing that I didn't mention before is we often don't include the economic cost of that service on our users. So if something takes longer for them to do, say, for example, it takes longer for that person to get into work. People in policy measure that cost, and they use those sorts of costs to be able to make policy. So why shouldn't you be measuring those sorts of costs in order to make strategic changes to your service? So it feels like the same argument that you're trying to make. So that actually might be going back to that question about how do you get policy people involved in that question. Maybe just worth going and finding some people in policy who might have answers to some of those questions. Find some economists, because I'm sure they're around, who've actually done that research, and you might be able to use it rather than doing it yourself. So yeah, always think about the cost that it's imposing on society and on users as well, even though Treasury and various other bits of government don't actually pay attention to that necessarily in terms of business cases. It's really, really important, particularly when you're talking about kind of at the service level changes to services.
I think we have one final question, which I think is actually in two parts, from Claire Brown. Claire, I think you mentioned in your second message that you would just come on and ask the question. Are you there, Claire? I'll just go ahead and ask the question. So Claire wanted to know about the idea for the book. Was it years in the making? Final thoughts on your time with GDS, or were you thinking about the book's content when you first started out in wayfinding / customer experience with Tate? Claire's asking as a former agency designer and typography obsessor.
Cool. Wow. Okay. So I feel like someone's LinkedIn stalked me. Thanks, Claire. That's a very good question. So yes, I suppose the thought for the book really is just something that was kind of mulling over in my head for my entire time, particularly at GDS, that I spent so much of my time having to explain all of this sort of stuff in person to people about what makes a good service. And it felt like almost that kind of good service design was something kind of private, that was something that was the access of people who were service designers, and that it wasn't something that could be clearly explained to people who actually were not designers, maybe not service designers, but just wanted to know what a good service was. And so that's why I wrote it. And it actually, in my mind, I wasn't writing it for designers. I was writing it for people who needed to really understand what a good service was, but were really frustrated by just every single service design book being about how to design a service, not what makes a good one, and everything about methodology and nothing about what you're supposed to be doing. And so that's why I wrote the book. But I think it's also what I found is really helpful for designers who have often bought it for people who they need to explain that message to, and actually they have not had to do that themselves. And so, here's a book, just go ahead and read that and come back to me in a week, is often what I find people are doing, which is kind of equally helpful and something for you to refer to. Often it's we spend a lot of our time, I think, as designers going over the basics and rediscovering the same things over and over again. Like, people couldn't find the service. You're like, great, okay, cool. Well, if you can create a framework that helps people to identify all of these really basic problems, then that means you can spend your time more efficiently looking at the problems that are really unique to your service. So that was the instance behind the book, and I hope it's done that for people. There is I should also say there's a scale you can use as well, that's free on good.services, where that you can use to monitor and understand the quality of your service against each of the 15 points. Super simple. As a Google Doc, there's a Miro template, there's a Excel spreadsheet and a PDF for anyone who's in the office and wants to do a physical workshop. But I would just use that and just sort of see where you get to. Hopefully that answered your question. Sorry.
I think Claire was going to jump on and ask the second part.
Oh yeah, go for it, Claire.
Hi, Lou. Thanks very much for that. Really helpful and detailed. It's kind of just a personal development question, actually. Everything you've talked about in the book is of interest. Somebody who's like 1 year into government, so you can imagine what I'm thinking 1 year later, out of agency life, after 7 years of agency life in marketing and design. So I haven't really formulated a thought about this, but I kind of am interested in everything about the book and have been for a long time, coming from an infographic editorial environment and service museum environment. And so I kind of, like, 1 year in, saturate myself with information about service design, because the design brain, I never switch off. So, like, a personal development question from a 1 year associate interaction designer is in, like, I want to know all of the things, but this isn't the question, it's just quite hard to switch off from all of the things. Are you able to do that, or did you find you could do that within the roles you've been involved in during the years, or just is it just never switch off? I don't know.
So that is a really good question. I'm really glad you asked, because it's something I've noticed, in the years that I've been managing designers outside of government and inside. One thing I've noticed is that the more people care about their job, the faster they burn out. And that is no less true, particularly of government designers who are often, we're here because we care about something. We're here because we want to make people's lives better. And we're also, kind of in an environment where often people don't understand what we're doing and don't necessarily kind of value it. That's equally difficult. And so we spend a lot of our time just really, really thinking constantly about why we're there, about whether or not we're doing a good job. And we're trying and so hard to kind of get that to happen, because we care so much about the outcome. And I think the thing I've noticed, and I've certainly experienced this, is you can only do that for so long without having a really negative effect on your own mental health. And it's a bit like that kind of adage of, when you get on a plane and it says, sort out your own mask before you sort out other people's. You have to be in a good place yourself to be able to actually help other people. And for me, that means being really strict about my working hours, and not working outside of the hours I'm supposed to be working. It also means I don't really read that many books about design. I mostly read books about kind of farming and gardening. I love gardening. I bought myself a spa subscription in a sort of mad whim of, kind of decadence last year, which I haven't really used very much. But I think the thing is, you just need to look after yourself and the people around you, and not hold yourself to superhuman standards, because designers aren't superhuman. They're humans like everyone else, and you need a break. So yeah, that would be my advice to you 1 year in, is just don't commit your whole self to this. Leave a little bit behind that does something else.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks everyone. Really great questions. There's been no further questions up on the chat, so I think everyone's all questioned out now. So I'd just like to thank you, Lou, for coming today. Fantastic talk. Really great questions from everyone. Really appreciate your time and insight. I think there was a few requests there just for links to the master classes and to some of the other training, and to the slides as well. So I'll get in touch with you after this, just to make sure that we've got all of those assets and that we can push those around the group here. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks very much for having me. It's lovely to talk to you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.